The koala is one of Australia's most iconic creatures. Along with the kangaroo and the emu, the koala is used to symbolise Australia on banknotes, on postage stamps and all manner of public buildings. Yet today, the koala is a threatened species, with some experts predicting it'll be extinct here in New South Wales by 2050, and it's partly because of bushfires. A recent report by the World Weather Attribution Consortium claimed that global warming contributed to the conditions that create bushfires by as much as 30%. But it's not just climate change. There are other factors that are also involved in the koala's demise. It's breakfast time in the koala pen at Sydney's world-famous Taronga Zoo. Early morning sees this much-loved marsupial at its most active. But as head koala keeper Laura Jones can testify, they're not easy to please.
Yeah, koalas are actually very challenging to look after. In some aspects, because they sit in trees and sleep all day, you think they're easy. Provide a tree, put some leaves in it. But the feeding part, the leaves, is where it gets really complicated.
In fact, the koala can only eat certain types of eucalyptus leaves, but food isn't the only problem. The fear is that zoos like this may one day be the only place to see a koala, as the population in the wild is destroyed by loss of habitat, disease, climate change, drought and bushfires. This is the grim reality of the fires. Here at a koala hospital in Port Macquarie, north of Sydney, veterinary surgeons battled to save victims of the flames. Such heart-rending scenes were shown around the world, prompting a global outpouring of grief and raising many millions of dollars to help save the animals. I first began reporting on the koala about a quarter of a century ago, when Australians were just beginning to wake up to the risk. On those occasions, koalas here in this area of southwest Sydney were largely cared for by a group of local volunteers. Now the protection efforts are becoming much better organised as the long-term survival of the koala becomes a race against time. Overall, an estimated 480 million mammals, birds and reptiles died in the most recent bushfires. Tens of thousands of them koalas, representing as much as 30% of the population. In some areas, as much as 80% of koala habitat was destroyed. It was one of the worst natural disasters in Australian modern history, and according to most scientists and koala experts, there's little doubt about the cause.
It's called climate change. I don't think you have to be a scientist to work that out.
It's not really that climate change is causing bushfires per se. We've always had bushfires in Australia, but climate change is making bushfires worse.
And in Australia, climate change had led to a drought, and it was those drought conditions that made the bushfires particularly severe in this case.
But while bushfires and climate change play a role, there are other factors such as logging and urban development which have led to the loss of the koala's natural habitat. Kate Fairman chaired a recent New South Wales government inquiry into the koala crisis and believes loss of habitat is also strongly linked to climate change.
We saw the devastating bushfires kill so many of our koalas here in New South Wales, so of course we have to tackle climate change, but koalas also need trees to live in. It's almost like a two-pronged factor, if you like, two-pronged approach. We need to tackle climate change, but we also need to stop clearing forests and protect their habitat.
However, the extent to which climate change has exacerbated the survival prospects of the koala is hotly disputed by some. Among those volunteers who defend the Australian bush in times of crisis are members of the Rural Fire Service. Captain Brendan O'Connor and his team helped to save many of the properties in his home village of Balmoral. But, controversially, he believes the bushfires had little to do with climate change and more to do with poor forestry management.
The biggest contributing factor, I believe, was fuel load, particularly out to our west in the Bargo State Recreation Area. In behind the interface of our village, that area had not had any hazard reduction work done for 18 years.
While the loss of koala habitat can be blamed on many factors, it's not all bad news. Here at Campbelltown, the koala population is actually increasing, thanks to the efforts of an environmentally active local council, which has planted thousands of eucalyptus trees to feed the koalas which live here.
Koalas are an Australian icon. We're so lucky to have koalas here in Campbelltown, and we really want to protect them for years to come. We want everyone to be able to enjoy koalas in Campbelltown forever.
It's not the only area where koala habitat is being boosted by the local council and volunteer organisations. Here at Port Stephens, north of Sydney, a koala sanctuary is about to open, and to help finance the venture, tourists will pay to stay in overnight accommodation so they can watch the koalas up close.
We will be the biggest facility of its type in New South Wales for some time to come. The government is now thankfully finally showing some concerns in addressing the biggest threat to koalas in New South Wales, and that's habitat loss.
Today, thanks to climate change and the bushfires, there's much more public awareness of the crisis facing koalas. Politicians are under much greater pressure to safeguard habitat, sometimes leading to tense standoffs among parliamentarians who recently threatened to bring down the New South Wales government if landowners didn't have greater protection too. The federal government is also under pressure to save the koala from extinction.
We're calling on the federal government to put in strong environmental laws that have an independent regulator, high standards, and that enable us as a country to be saying that we're doing everything to protect the iconic species like koalas and many other species which are at threat.
In truth, the koala has not fared well under European settlement. In the last century, they were almost hunted to extinction. Today, the population is somewhere between 40 and 100,000 and falling fast.
Because of the specialist nature, because we don't have the luxury of just, popping more koalas out there in the wild, because the wild at the moment is not a safe place, until we have the protections in place, koalas are going to continue to decline.
But in the final analysis, it's the thought that New South Wales could lose one of its most vulnerable species in the next 30 years that spurs all Australians to guard against the koala's demise. After all the gloom about the koala's long-term prospects, there is hope as long as Australia addresses the many and varied threats to this iconic species. And while climate change is obviously a key issue, the march of urbanisation and the subsequent loss of habitat will also need addressing.
Mumbai was built on what was once just a series of islands. Much of it is low-lying. With climate change, the financial capital of India is at great risk. Scientists predict that the city is one of many globally that could be largely underwater by 2050. But we don't have to wait another 30 years to see the effects of global warming.
For Mumbai's slum dwellers, climate change has taken the meaning of living on the edge to a whole new level. Ketan Corey lives in one of the slum homes here. With the houses so close to the water, residents like Mr. Corey are directly exposed to the threat of rising seas. In recent years, his house has been badly flooded several times during heavy rains.
लेकिन ये फ्लडिंग जो हुई थी तो इससे थोड़ा मन में डर रहा, अभी आगे भी डर रहेगा कि अगर कुछ आगे होएगा तो क्या होगा। अभी बेसिकली अभी जो मेरा घर है तो मेरे घर को मेरे को प्रोटेक्ट करना पड़ता है, हर बार चेक करना पड़ता है, कुछ प्रॉब्लम तो नहीं है घर के अंदर, कोई दीवार ये नहीं है।
Slum dwellers by the sea like Mr. Corey might be the most vulnerable when it comes to the impact of rising seas in one of the most densely populated cities in the world. But it's actually a much wider problem for India's financial capital than many may realise. In 30 years, the city could be largely submerged during high tide.
This is one of the most desirable locations to live in Mumbai, but by 2050, this place, including where I'm standing, is projected to be below the tide line. The multi-million-dollar apartments here, along with much of the city, won't escape the impact of rising seas.
The ominous forecast is based on an assessment by US-based organisation Climate Central, and it factors in moderate reductions in carbon emissions. Dosant Govind doesn't know anything about climate change, but as a fisherman, he knows Mumbai's seas better than most.
पहले ही देखो, पहले जो समंदर था वो थोड़ा कम था. अभी देखो जैसे दिन ब दिन साल पर साल वैसे पानी की मतलब लहरें बढ़ती जा रही हैं. पहले जो पानी था वो नीचे रहता था, अभी जो पानी है ऊपर आ गया है.
He's also noticed that the weather conditions have become more extreme. In June, along with other fishermen, he had to return from sea as Cyclone Nisarga, the strongest cyclone in the area for more than a century, hurtled towards Mumbai.
It becomes a bigger issue when other extremes overlap with the sea level rise. For example, there are extreme rainfall events, rain events where the rainfall is above 150 millimeter per day. So these kind of rainfall events, when they overlap with the sea level rise, this can result in a situation where you have prolonged floods for a longer period than we expect.
Last year, some 2,000 people were killed in India's heaviest monsoon season in 25 years. But part of the problem is man-made. Mumbai's mangroves and floodplains that naturally absorb water have been destroyed to make way for construction, exacerbating flooding. Studies show that the city lost nearly 40% of its mangroves between 1991 and 2001, about 9,000 acres. Environmentalist Rishi Agrawal had in the past successfully campaigned to save hundreds of acres of Mumbai's mangroves. With a passion for nature, Mr. Rishi developed an interest in environmental conservation as a teenager and decided this would be his life's focus. He's frustrated that there's not enough being done about climate change in India.
There is no polar ice cap close to Mumbai, there's no glacier close to Mumbai. Whatever is happening thousands of kilometers away. But all of us are into it together, and when the sea levels rise, they will rise uniformly.
A recent survey by Ipsos reveals that 81% of urban Indians say they're concerned about climate change and place it at par with the COVID-19 crisis. Residents I spoke to in Mumbai said the government needs to take the lead in tackling the issue.
We as citizens would definitely like to know more about it, and we would like to get some suggestions on what we can do as just citizens as well to counter this. Maybe we could not be able to stop it completely.
I mean, people are not that serious about this whole situation, and government should, just press on it a little bit. And there needs to be some estimates.
As a student, government should do a lot of things to, to make people aware.
The state government of Maharashtra, where Mumbai is located, recently renamed its Environment Ministry as the Department of Environment and Climate Change.
Mumbai is a city that was created out of water. It was built on a cluster of islands through extensive reclamation nearly 2 centuries ago. The city of more than 12 million people is inherently susceptible to flooding, and rising seas will only exacerbate the situation.
Last month, Mumbai experienced particularly heavy flooding during the monsoon rains. We visited a location near one of the main business districts that was badly affected by the flooding at the time. Residents told us they were alarmed to see areas that don't normally flood getting waterlogged, and some of the flooding took a long time to recede.
इतना बारिश गिरा कि बताने का बात नहीं है. इतना बारिश हुआ रात भर, पूरा बारिश कम से कम रात को 8:30-9 बजे चालू हुआ और रात को पूरा घर में पानी था. हमारा सामान बचाने के इतना बहुत कोशिश किया तो रात भर हम तो सोया नहीं, हमारा परिवार भी सोया नहीं. क्या है, बेड के ऊपर बेड चढ़ा के हमने कैसा रात गुजारा हम.
Environmentalist Rishi Agrawal says to hold back the tides of climate change, doing nothing is not an option. To start with, he says people should demand action from their local bureaucrats and look at how they can change their own lifestyles. He adds that steps such as improving public transport and waste management are easily achievable and would help reduce emissions.
Possibly the worst effects will not be felt by the current generation of people residing in Mumbai. The worst effects might be felt by maybe 2 or 3rd generation. I mean, we need to find out whether we have that value system or the character to be able to bother about that generation which is yet to come.
The Amazon rainforest continues to burn, with the highest number of fires on record. Thousands of miles away in Britain, companies could be feeling the heat soon. The UK government is looking at a new law that could help prevent deforestation there and in other rainforests around the world. The plan would see large British companies fined if they cannot prove their supply chains do not contribute to illegal deforestation. But how effective can such legislation be with a problem that's so far away? I'm going to find out. The things we buy have consequences for other people and for ourselves. It's not just what happens to these products after we use them, it's what has to happen for them to get to us in the first place. And for many products, that includes the destruction of forests.
Rainforests play this crucial role in regulating the global environment. They help provide us with the clean air that we breathe, fresh water, and of course play a key role in the fight against climate change. So if we think about the Amazon rainforest, for example, there is no plausible solution that doesn't rely on having a functioning Amazon rainforest on the planet. There is no way that we can avoid dangerous global climate change if we don't stop deforesting around the world.
A geologist by training, Mike Barrett spent over 12 years in the UK government focusing on biodiversity, international forestry and climate change policy before joining WWF UK in 2013. There he works on raising public awareness about how our purchases can end up supporting harmful practices elsewhere. In this case, how forests are cleared to make room for products like palm oil, rubber, soya and animal feed, reducing biodiversity and removing trees which help keep the planet cool. The UK government recognises that's a problem and wants to do something about it, so it set up the Global Resource Initiative Task Force to try to find pragmatic solutions. It's made up of businesses, government departments and charities who want to tackle the footprint of the UK outside its own borders. The chair of the task force is Sir Ian Cheshire.
What we're proposing is to create a legal obligation to take responsibility for your supply chain. That doesn't exist at the moment.
It's recommending the UK's largest companies prove their suppliers don't illegally clear forest to make their products, with financial penalties for those who don't follow the rules. Businesses would have to make sure they're not supporting illegal deforestation based on the laws of that particular country.
90% of the deforestation that is happening is illegal anyway under the local regime. So let's start there, because if we can help the producing countries stamp out illegal deforestation, that will have the biggest single impact we can have.
The plan relies on the producer country having strong laws, and that's not always the case. Only this month, the Brazilian government tried to roll back laws protecting some of its most important forests. That's where JBS is based, Brazil's largest exporter of beef and one of the largest meatpacking companies in the world. Rearing cattle requires lots of space, with some ranches making room by clearing forest. Land may also be cleared to make room to grow animal feed. But JBS uses satellite imagery to make sure its direct suppliers are not cutting down trees, which is the kind of supply chain tracking this law would require.
The system uses satellite imagery and georeference data about the supplier ranchers to monitor an area of more than 50,000 square kilometers in the legal Amazon region.
It's expensive and difficult to make sure no part of the supply chain contributes to illegal deforestation, especially as rainforests are difficult to access for monitoring and enforcement. There is one way to avoid all that complexity though.
grow it all right here. It's such a lovely, diverse mixture.
British rancher Nick Fuller says he can be certain his operation doesn't contribute to deforestation. Not only are his cattle all reared on his farm south of London, but all their feed is grown here too.
We're basically growing a cocktail of grasses and legumes for them.
By keeping all parts of the process local, his supply chain is easy to monitor.
Everything they eat is produced on the farm. We don't import any feed whatsoever. No grain, nothing is imported. You know, we have to keep our animals a little bit longer than perhaps some beef farmers would, but we're keeping them in a cheaper form, so it works out for us.
Fuller started farming over a decade ago, and he's noticed this way of doing things is becoming more popular.
They're very set in their ways, farmers, and that's how they've done it, so that's how they carry on doing it. But there are more and more people trying to do things on a more forage-based diet, certainly.
Although this style of farming avoids nearly all of the issues associated with international supply chains, it can't feed the country.
We would be massively supportive of the UK and local farmers replacing import chains that come from other sides of the world. But the reality is we will not be, for example, on something like timber or beef, be able to deal with all our own consumption from domestic supplies.
So, for now, campaigners agree fixing the supply chain matters for producer countries and consumers.
It's in our interests as consumers to have sustainable supply chains that are going to be there in perpetuity. It's not good for us to be importing products that are simply not going to be available in future years because we have trashed the landscapes from where they're coming.
The law should help consumers buy in confidence, knowing the products haven't come from deforested land. But this is just one proposed solution from one country. And critics worry this tackles only illegal deforestation and only forces large companies to make a change.
But for now, many businesses and NGOs agree this is a move in the right direction, at least until such a time consumer habits change.